We wanted to hop on here to go through this nested organization of ecosystems from the prior article by Brian Fox on training ecosystems. So did you want to go ahead and maybe kind of explain what we're looking at here?
Yeah, so this is a diagram that sort of we created to show different ecosystems and how those ecosystems relate not only to the athlete, but also the sporting environment in which that athlete will compete in. So if we look at the diagram, you can see the outer blue circle, or the bigger blue circle, which is the outer ring, shows that external ecosystem. So when we talk about anything related to an external ecosystem, we're talking outside of the athlete. So this is the sporting environment. We labeled that the level of competition. So when we talk about the nested organization of ecosystems, we're essentially talking about not necessarily a hierarchical structure, because it doesn't exist one level to the next, but there are levels. And when you think of levels and what we call the nested organization, these levels are constantly changing based on the organization of the system. So it's not like the level of competition is higher than what we'll get into, which is the level of adaptation. These are constantly dynamically changing, but they're nested within each other, which is why it's a nested organization. Somewhat fractal, I guess, if you want to use that term. So the external ecosystem, or the sporting environment, is the level of competition. This is where inherently the demands of that particular sport or the performance of that sport would exist. This is also why we called it the level of competition, because this is where you're going to have to have an athlete be able to meet those demands to ultimately win the level of competition, or win the constant battles that would exist within that sporting environment. Within that, displayed on the diagram by the outer black circle, which is the next sort of ring in the nested organization, is what we call the level of adaptation. And within the level of adaptation, you have 4 other circles that are all interrelated, and this is the athlete. So this is the athlete that is nested internally. So this is the internal ecosystem that is nested within the sporting environment. So this is, sort of built up into what we called 4 different things here: the nervous system, the muscle components of that athlete, the joint components of that athlete, as well as the connective tissue components of that athlete. We call this the level of adaptation because this is where you get into the capacities of that athlete to actually be able to meet the demands of the sporting environment. So this is where we get a little bit more specific into how we are going to create necessary positive adaptations, otherwise known as, let's call it, behavioral changes, whether that be a strength behavior or whether that be a skilled behavior of the athlete to meet the level of competition within the sporting environment. So this is sort of our understanding or our explanation of this diagram, which really displays what we call the nested organization of ecosystems, which really kind of permeates what we'll call ecological training, and why ecological training, or looking at strength training ecologically, allows you to kind of figure out what the level of competition is for a particular athlete, what environment do they have to exist and succeed in, and then funneling that down into what adaptations need to be made or maintained in that athlete to allow them to succeed within their sporting environment.
Yeah, perfect. So to start to tie this into other work that we've put out there, the first article in Stagnation in Sport. So you're saying that Tiger Woods essentially stagnated first at this black athlete level, but then now that's something that we can see in this external level.
Correct.
Okay. And then kind of after that article, we wrote about how, you know, there's a difference between training for skill and then training for physical capacity. And this kind of delineates that as well, right? Where that level of competition or the external ecosystem is realistically where skill acquisition is going to be emerging from.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, you know, that now that we're kind of staring at this diagram, you know, we could probably add to this diagram, because part of this diagram that we could add to would be the skill acquisition component, right? Part of what I would call skill acquisition exists internally to be outputted and observed externally. So it kind of is the boundary between, you know, on the diagram here, the level of adaptation and the level of competition. That boundary is where skill acquisition occurs.
Oh, right. Yeah, I follow. Okay.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
Because we really delineated this diagram to show the nested organization of ecosystems from a strength training perspective. And I think this is probably something that is worthwhile discussing. So when we talk about like the ecological approach or sort of the ecological nature of training for strength, this is what we're referring to, that there is an environment that the athlete has to exist in. So we need to know the demands of that environment, because all of those demands are going to have certain strength behaviors that the athlete must have and be able to possess if they are going to succeed in that environment. Mm-hmm. That's where human performance kind of exists in. But then internally, there are certain behaviors, like smaller behaviors, which again relates to the nested organization, that allows for that success. Correct? And then some people, at least in our discussions with people that have read our articles up to this point, there is a particular theory in skill acquisition that is called ecological dynamics, right? Whereby, you know, learning, you know, sort of the nuts and bolts of ecological dynamics is essentially how someone uses information from that external environment to then change or modify their behavior in learning how to perform sporting-based skills. Mm-hmm. Those two things are separate, right? So when we talk skill acquisition comes from the internal dynamics of the athlete and how they are able to use certain behavioral qualities of joints and connective tissues and muscles, and, you know, having this continual resource of nervous system availability for them to continually learn how to refine skill. Mm-hmm. But specifically for us in this diagram, we're talking only about training for strength behaviors and how training for strength behaviors allows somebody to succeed in their particular sport that will have inherent strength demands. Not all sports have the same inherent strength demands, as we know, right? So that's what we're trying to get across in this particular diagram. And so what we don't have on here is that component of skill acquisition. But skill acquisition comes from the internal components of the athlete, and then how the nervous system synthesizes that, plus the information from the external environment to be able to refine and learn and modify their ability to possess certain skills related to that sport.
Right, right. Yeah, and so getting back to that article, Brian did a good job of essentially saying that you have to train at these different levels or into these, put, funnel work into these nervous system, joint, connective tissue level, right? And so we kind of followed it up this week with a resource guide in regards
That's
to the
right.
conjugate method, right? Because, like Brian said in that article, it becomes quite daunting for, okay, well, how do I start to program in a manner where all these ecosystems are getting, specific and optimal work funneled into it so that they can change and evolve over time. And the only way that you can do that is through utilizing the conjugate method or
Correct.
conjugate methoded philosophy, which we introduced everyone to two resources to start at that. But to simply kind of understand conjugate method and what it means is that it kind of means that, if you're training, let's say, only the nervous system to do one thing, you're going to get singular effects. But if you want to train the nervous system plus, let's say, joint, now what you're going to do is you're going to get cumulative multifaceted training effects. And so essentially what the conjugate method does is it's a complex form of training where what you're trying to do and what is actually being done and has been proven to be done, which is why it's the most effective or the gold standard for training, is you're programming multiple means and multiple methods simultaneously and sequencing them in a manner which you get cumulative multifaceted training effects instead of singular training effects.
Correct.
So to kind of put everything all together, what we wanted people to understand from this piece is that, or from this diagram is that, like Brian stated, that we have to be training at all these levels, which we've alluded to prior in the past, but now specifically, and that you have to do them concurrently, like all together at once, because like you said, these are dynamic things. These are not static things, right? That's where a linear-based periodization would fail, right? Linear-based periodization would basically say that, hey, you've acquired, this behavior or this tissue-based capacity, and now that you have it, you just stop training for it and start training for something else. Well, obviously, as soon as you remove that training that is constraining and keeping that dynamic capacity at that level, that capacity will then start to diminish.
Correct.
Which is once again why it kind of goes back to, okay, well, if you're going to program optimally, you're going to have to program utilizing a conjugate based philosophy.
That's right. That's right. And so that also kind of relates to this diagram, and we've talked about, you and I have talked about this in the past, whereby, if you think about programming generally, this diagram can help you with that to some extent as well, because if you understand the level of competition of a particular sport and what an athlete should display, there is an inherent neurological capacity that is necessary for that athlete in that particular sport. Correct?
Okay, so what you're saying is you can look at the external ecosystem or the sporting environment and use that as a feedback mechanism to then start to train.
Correct. Correct.
Yeah.
Because obviously you do a lot of work with football linemen. So the level of competition for a football lineman is going to come with certain necessities that the football lineman must possess. Mm-hmm. Right? And that will be different than, and I'll use my son as an example, or my kids as an example, who play hockey. The level of competition in that sport as a hockey athlete is going to be far different. But in that there are the demands of the sport are going to be different. It doesn't necessarily mean that training per se is going to be extremely different from a very basic perspective, because there's still going to be requirements that have to be met from a strength perspective. So that level of competition can help you decide or determine what the neurological outputs of that athlete should be. And here we're talking about like, max strength or like absolute strength, right? There's a certain absolute strength requirement of a lineman that is going to be far different than a hockey athlete.
Yeah, so let me build on what you just said there. So essentially what you're saying is, while the means may be different, so a lineman may use a rack pull or a box squat to build maximal strength, whereas a hockey player may do, regular full squats or single leg stuff for max strength. The same method, maximal effort method, as defined by Dr. Zatorsky, will be utilized because that's the superior method, like we've stated before, to actually build that muscular strength. And then the same thing is, if you look at, well, you're also going to train, the hockey athlete to be able to discharge strength at the highest attainable speed. Okay, well, once again, there's a strength training method for that. So we're seeing the overlapping of methods, but based off of the sporting environment, external ecosystem, there's a reconfiguration of what one athlete needs compared to another athlete. But the cool part about that is, you can start to really constrain the training at both the internal and external level to really finely tune that athlete's, these systems that you see here, joint, connective tissue, muscle, nervous system, to really be in a primed position for optimal skill acquisition to occur with, let's say, optimal skill acquisition, meaning the player or the athlete possesses and has developed the requisite physical capacities for that skill.
Correct. So, so to continue on a little bit, then, like what we can say is we can say that there is going to be a strength requirement of every athlete that allows them to essentially beat the competition at the level of competition.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so when we talk about, and that's why we termed it the level of competition, because this is where you're either going to win or lose. Individual battles. If you're a lineman, you're going to win or lose that battle with another lineman. If you're a hockey athlete, you're going to win or lose that corner battle with another athlete. That win or loss of that battle is dependent upon strength. And the ability to have a certain amount of it, which is why at the level of competition, we talk a lot about, max strength demands of those particular athletes, because when we can understand that that athlete is able to meet a max strength demand, we know right off the bat that they have the ability to meet and beat the level of competition. To take that athlete even further and create multifaceted effects is when you get down into the actual internal ecosystem, whereby you can take that neurological resource of max strength and learn how to tune it in individual ways, depending upon which ecosystem you are training and when.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So like if you, as a very basic examples, and we're going to probably hash these out over the next long period of time that we're writing this, is that at a connective tissue level, if we have an absolute amount of strength, or we have an athlete that is able to display a certain amount of strength at a connective tissue level, and that max strength is based on a neurological output, because that's what max strength is. It's a neurological output. At connective tissue level, we've talked about this before, the ability of connective tissue to generate stiffness, the quickness of the connective tissue to generate that stiffness isn't really dependent per se on the nervous system's ability to generate that stiffness, right?
Yeah.
So now that we have, remember we talked about that? Like it
Yeah.
happened, that ability to generate stiffness happens too quickly in a lot of sporting environments.
Yeah.
So
Which state specifically what you're saying, because what you're saying is reactive strength is not a nervous system based capacity, but a tissue based capacity, specifically a connective tissue based capacity.
right, but 100%. And so, but the ability to build that reactive strength and use resources that exist within that athlete to build reactive strength is somewhat built on that athlete's max strength capabilities.
Yeah, of course.
You know what I'm saying? So now you're really looking at the nested organization of the ecosystem from a training perspective, and programming multiple things simultaneously to create these various effects that will build on each other. So now you have an athlete that is able to generate a magnitude of force from a neurological perspective, and now you're moving that athlete into reactive strength, which is inherently built off this magnitude, but not directly related to this magnitude.
Yes.
And now you're creating this reactive ability in this athlete to generate connective tissue stiffness. Well, that reactive strength that is within that connective tissue ecosystem is going to create an effect on the maximum ability of that athlete to generate strength. So now you have a monster, right? You move that into a joint, the joint ecosystem. The ability to create space in a joint and train a joint is dependent upon an ability to output a nervous system output. So now that ability to take that maximum strength ability or force output ability can now be funneled into creating more workspace in a joint. And why is that important? Well, from a sporting perspective, if I have more joint space, I have more adaptability of that joint, which then if I have that in multiple joints, now I'm creating the ability to create time and space both at a joint level and in a performance perspective. So now I give myself a little bit more time to be adaptable in this, one-on-one battle per se. And now I have the ability to take my absolute maximal strength and funnel it into the joint, funnel it into the connective tissue. And now I have, all of these effects that if that other athlete hasn't trained, well, I'm going to win that battle.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's kind of what we're really, why we really wanted to talk about this particular diagram, because, this diagram was embedded in Brian's article because Brian talked about ecological training. So we wanted to kind of show the nested organization of ecosystems. But this is a diagram that is really important to us because it really kind of shows a bunch of different things in terms of how we look at things ecologically, how we look at the ability of demands and capacities, how we would essentially then figure out and use those two things to kind of reverse engineer programming, how we would then program using the conjugate nature of programming to then build these multifaceted training effects.
Yeah. So to tie it in for some other people too, so we have the conjugate method resource guide, which shows you how to utilize multiple means and multiple methods simultaneously to create the cumulative multifaceted training effects. We have, remember the roadmap or establishing point A? Establishing point A was essentially using that external ecosystem to do so, right? And then we kind of went through what training work is, what stagnation is, all that other stuff. So this diagram ties into a lot of articles that we've already done, and we we'll obviously modify it and continue to build it. But do you have anything else that you want to say?
Yeah, I would just say that we're gonna, as we move forward and we get into the discussion of performance in multiple sports, this diagram will come up again, because you'll see how we use this diagram, with respect to different sports, and how this diagram and this organization is dynamic, and it helps you kind of determine what the ecological nature of sport is, and how that would then define internal training of that athlete.